All right, thank you. Our next presenter is Mr. James Bone. He is an industry leader and practitioner with more than 30 years of senior risk leadership experience, thought leader in cybersecurity and enterprise risk management, and the author of Cognitive Hack, The New Battleground in Cybersecurity, The Human Mind, and he's also the founder of Innovative Solutions for the Human Element of Risk Management. And I would tell you, I'm a big fan of Mr. James Bone because he's a man to really understand the human element in cybersecurity and how do we do a better job of mitigating the human element. And so with that being said, I'm going to get out of the way and turn this thing over to my good friend, Mr. James Bone, as he talked to us about something that I really love, human factors.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here. And, you know, I hope that some of you have been exposed to this topic. Some of you may not have been, but let me try my best to make sense of why this is important and why this topic has been missed for the most part, and in some cases ignored. But let me explain why. So, you know, the purpose of this topic is to talk about how to quantify the human factor in cybersecurity. And there's an old saying that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And there are a number of organizations, the insurance industry, actuaries, some mathematicians, data scientists are trying to quantify the risk of cybersecurity. But I want to provide a broad context for what it is and what may be missing, because if you measure the wrong thing, it still won't be very effective. So just a quick point on me. My background, I was Chief Risk and Compliance Officer for Fidelity Investments. For about 20 some odd years, I was responsible for enterprise risk and cybersecurity. About 10 years ago, I decided, actually more than that, decided to leave the firm and do research on what is now called the cyber paradox. We were spending a lot of money on technology then, and one of the problems is that no matter how much money we spent on cybersecurity, the problem continued to advance. And so this presentation is based on about 20 years of research with a multidisciplinary approach. Okay, so next slide. So why quantify risk? So, you know, the idea of quantifying performance is not new, but we're still learning how to do it. I mean, prior to recent times, a convergence of events didn't exist. For example, in most professional athletics, teams picked talent based on very subjective measures, right? It may have been experience that the recruiter had in an area. It may have been the personality of the person. It may, some cases, have been some of their data from high school and college. But the idea of quantifying performance was very subjective and very limited. The same thing is true in cybersecurity. We are really at the early stages of understanding how to quantify cybersecurity. So, and the reason for that is because the quality of the data is not very good. And that is because there is a lot of data, but it is hard to develop insights from all of the data that we have. And we think that in my research, what I've learned is that we're focusing on some areas of performance that may not be adding value in the understanding of the risk associated with the threats in cyber. So as a result of that, there is one area that we believe that you can measure performance, and that is the human element. And that is what I think many of the sports teams have learned as well, is that if you measure areas of performance, you gather lots of data, and you trend that data over time, you begin to get in patterns, learn patterns, and get insight into human performance. And those elements allow you to better address either gaps in your performance, or in our case, issues and exposures related to cybersecurity. So why is that important? That's important because as we transition to Industry 4.0, it's accelerating in a number of different industries and at different places. And it's accelerating faster than we have the ability to actually quantify the impact of these changes, both to people and to processes and to organizations over time, right? We are moving faster than human ability really to keep track of all of the changes that are going on. That's a problem, right? And so if we're not managing those changes, what we're doing, in fact, is we're increasing exposure potentially to future cyber attacks because we're not looking at what those impacts to the changes are. And so when you think about the Internet of Things, the number of devices that are being connected, our recent guest talked about the cloud. All of those areas increase the exposure to cyber threats in the environment. And so we need to measure those things. Okay. One way to measure that if any of you follow Daniel Kahneman, this Noise is the title of his most recent book. And what Dan Kahneman said basically is that if he went back in time when he won his Nobel Prize, he would have written this book first. And that is because when he introduced the ideas of heuristics and biases, heuristics being the skills and experience and body of knowledge that we develop over time, and biases being what some people think are purely, discussions about racial differences or whether we like people, but Kahneman looked at it very differently. Biases are really making consistently erroneous decisions on a regular basis, as opposed to focus on the standard bias. But bias has become sort of the common reference to what Kahneman is doing, but that's not exactly the case. And so this idea of error, decision error, is a problem. So let me give you one example, because I've heard a number of speakers talk about and reference this idea of zero trust, okay? Now, I am a supporter of zero trust, but I want people to understand that there is an Achilles heel to zero trust. It's a fairly big Achilles heel that I think is overlooked, maybe not ignored, but certainly overlooked in terms of importance. And that Achilles heel is that zero trust assumes that every company have people with the skills to develop the platform, the network requirements, the processes, right, the procedures, and the change in the organization that needs to take place to make zero trust work. There's an implied assumption that we all have the same skill to do this, okay? It should be obvious that that's not a very accurate assumption on any basis, right? So zero trust is a philosophy. How you implement it in your organization depends on the skills of the people in the organization. And if everybody does it differently, if every organization does it differently, we would call that noise, right? Noise is the subjective decisions that organizations make on a regular basis that have implied error in them, okay? And that error is what leads to exposure to cybersecurity. And because there are so many things that we do that depend on subjective judgment, there's a great deal of error that exists in enterprise risk, operational risk, and cybersecurity, right? Because we do not have well-defined processes that are based on scientific analysis that can be repeated over and over again with high degree of confidence, right? That we're applying a lot of these practices using subjective judgment. And we're assuming everyone has the same skill and ability. So we think that these errors can be measured. And we're going to talk about how we do that as we go. So first of all, there is a saying in cyberspace, cybersecurity, that the human element is the weakest link in cybersecurity, right? And the reality is that there's a tremendous amount of data that demonstrates that that is correct, okay? However, as Kahneman said, just because we know that biases and heuristics are a problem, awareness of the problem is not sufficient. We need more information than that. And so we're going to talk about how we go beyond just the understanding that humans are the weakest link. And by the way, most organizations when they think about the human element, they think about the insider threat. The human element is much bigger than that. So that's, in my opinion, that's another one of those fallacies where, because of Eric Snowden, the Snowden paradox has become the rallying cry around human risk. And the percentages of Eric Snowden's in the workplace is pretty small. However, incidental losses, errors, bad judgment, workforce workflows, there are so many other areas in the organization that contribute to errors by the human element that it completely outweighs the insider threat. And so, again, this is an area that is not well defined, but we've centered on it because it was a very high profile event. Now, there are a number of psychological reasons I will not get into right now why we focus on things that are in the news versus understanding the data that tells us what the risks exposures are. But hopefully you will understand by the end of this presentation that that this is the reason why focusing on data is so important. So we know that the sophistication of cyber threats is expanding. And some of the areas that have been central to the expansion of cyber threats are attacks based on human people, targeting human behavior as humans touch the internet, targeting our behavior on the internet and social media, and exploiting our ability or our sort of consistency in trusting technology and trusting surfing the internet. So phishing, social engineering, cognitive hacks, these are actually very strategic approaches that are launched by some of the most sophisticated hackers in order to steal our data, break into company systems, and exploit vulnerabilities in the internet. So this was from this study was from Protivity, a research firm, consulting firm, and surprisingly, they asked CISOs and enterprise risk professionals, what are the top 10 risks? And if you look through this list, either directly or indirectly, the human element plays a big part in these risks. So, you know, it used to be 40, 30 years ago when I started my practice in risk management as a enterprise risk manager and a cyber information security officer, we focused on hard assets. We focused on the enterprise. We focused on technology, authentication, access administration. And we primarily focused on those things inside of the organization, right? If we had business with people outside of the organization, we tended to make them responsible for those risks. But here you can see that many of these things are outside the organization: the pandemic, economic conditions, digital technologies and invention, innovation, and inside the organization, leadership, succession, resistance to change, right? Our inability to compete. These are, so in fact, human behavior is actually becoming one of the biggest risks that we need to manage. But there are no risk frameworks that exist today that address or point to the risk of human behavior, not just inside a threat, but holistically, governance, management, oversight, the right risk practices, the right cyber practices, the right audit practices. All of these behavior-based activities do not have a framework for evaluation, honestly, on how well they're performing. Okay, so this is important because humans are sort of an equivalent with uncertainty risk, right? Because human behavior can't always be predicted. And therefore, a focus on simply looking at behavioral analytics data actually will be misleading, right? It may give you an idea of what some employees are doing, but the fact that an organization is monitoring human behavior analytics tells people that they need to be careful with their behavior and therefore try to find ways around the controls that are being put in place to monitor their behavior. So the idea here is that we need to understand things like how behavior takes place, right? And one of the ways to do that, we'll talk about this as we go, but one of the ways to do that is to actually develop methods for tracking human behavior through both quantitative data and some qualitative approaches. And so why do we want to do that? So the reason that we want to do that is because we spend a lot of time, and many organizations use audit as a way to evaluate risks, to evaluate our cybersecurity processes, to evaluate and measure the exposures that we have in the firm. But there is a concept called what you see is all there is. And this concept describes a fallacy in thinking that if you only focus on the data that's easily discoverable, for example, audit data, the policies, the procedures, events, and you don't look at human behavior, you don't look outside of the organization for sources of data that may give you insight beyond what's happening in your organization, that you will miss quite a bit of very useful data. Another area that is a source of tremendous amount of human data is in our ERP systems in the organization, where we store tons of data on individuals or track human behavior as we move people across the organization. And look at time on job, look at skill set, look at how we've aligned training and education to how people do their jobs. There are a number of ways to look at a cross-section of data to get a better understanding of human behavior how human behavior can lead to both risk in cybersecurity, risk in operations, risk in governance, because we have blind spots in the organization. So there's a tremendous amount of opportunity to understand risks on a much broader scale, as opposed to the things that we do today, where we develop risk inventories, right? And we sit and monitor those same risks year after year in that inventory, and we're not looking at the risks that we don't know and understand areas of risk that we don't know, right? When we think about human error, we're talking about operational risk, right? People at work, people using system, people using technology, people communicating up the chain of command, down the chain of command, and across the organization, communications, right? But we do those things using technology. So there's a great deal of opportunity when you think about the simple dynamic of human factors equal operational risks, create exposures, create human error. And so being thoughtful about humans interacting with technology and how we communicate, where we communicate, and the means by which we work together, get work done. We're going to talk about how that can help us in ways that we haven't leveraged in the past. And by the way, it's important to understand that the regulatory environment is starting to understand and recognize that human behavior is the basis for governance. And in fact, they're incorporating measures of risk behavior into new regulation. For example, the capital model for large financial services banks have incorporated human risk behavior in their regulatory requirements. So not only are there quantitative measures for capital, but there are now quantitative measures that are related to decisions around the composition of capital. How did you come to those conclusions? How did you develop and make judgments about risk appetite, right? How do you think about these operational risk errors, human errors? And what are you doing? How much data are you collecting? What kinds of data are you collecting in order to understand the right levels of judgment, right? And then how do you measure risk reduction? Do you measure risk reduction? And what benchmarks are you using in order to measure risk reduction? We take these things for granted, I believe, in a lot of organizations. And I think if you think about the opportunity to look at these data in a different way, we have an opportunity to impact performance. And so the solvency model in the insurance industry is starting to do the same thing, right? So these regulatory regimes are starting to look at how does our model stack up with our behavior? Are we doing what we say we're doing? And are we doing it well? How do we measure it? So this idea of noise, calculating noise, is an interesting concept because this is something that I felt, I'm not a Nobel Prize economist, I felt was missing in Kahneman's work in prospect theory. Prospect theory is the theory of heuristics and biases. It's the theory that combines psychology with economics. And it is that in economic theory, men believe that they could pursue successfully their ends using subjective measures, and they thought they could do that optimally. So think about that, right? It assumed that men always believes that they have the skills and ability to always make rational choices because they know all of the risks, they know all the issues, all the upside and downside, and they always make those decisions optimally. When psychologists got involved, they said, well, the reality is that the evidence says otherwise, right? We are not always rational. We see that today in the war with Russia and Ukraine. But it doesn't even have to be that, that dramatic, right? We make mistakes on a regular basis, big and small. So the theory of economic man was wrong. So psychologists said, well, how do we make decisions? How do we do so, not in a way that's perfect every time, but how do we optimize our decision making? Herbert Simon said, we typically operate with bounded rationality. Okay, so the ultimate bounded rationality is the future and uncertainty. Our inability to see and predict the future with 100% insight is our limiting factor. But how do we improve on that? And so noise is about recognizing when we're making those mistakes. And so what many of the computer scientists who are developing machine learning and artificial intelligence has taught us is that rational choice, decision-making is really all about reducing error. And the way you reduce error is you have to reduce variance, meaning the divergence of variance in decision-making and the bias in decision-making. And you have to reduce those two equally, okay? So this is actually a machine learning algorithm to improve the outcomes of AI systems, right? So ideally, if this works for artificial intelligence, it works for humans as well, right? If you put the same algorithm into a spreadsheet, it should give you a better outcome. In other words, the way Kahneman described it is that when people are making decisions, they're shooting for a target. Okay? They may not know the absolute bullseye, but they have a target that they're shooting for. And when people make decisions, they're looking for, they want to be team A, where they're consistently hitting the target. Team B is actually consistently off target in the same direction. That's bias. Okay? That's the bias in statistical analysis that we're really focused on. Team C is noise. Team C is the variance in the variance, right? We're both, we're dispersed in our decision-making, and we're consistently off from target, consistently missing the target. And Team D is really a combination of both. But the point is that to get closer to becoming a high-performing team on a consistent basis, you have to reduce noise and bias in your decision making. So Kahneman did a study. He said, let's prove this. He said, let's take a look at this problem and how do we recognize it? And he demonstrated this in an insurance company. I won't give you the whole case study, but it's very, very simple. They looked at two groups. They looked at the actuaries and the claims adjusters. And basically what Kahneman did was he said, how do you select your actuaries to pick a policy when they're judging risk? How do they select them? And the company said basically is that it's random. Who's ever next in line will judge the policy for whether it's worth our risk to take. And so the purpose of the study was what is the variance in the selection of risk by each of the actuaries across the company. And so, the guess by management was, pretty narrow, 7 to 10%. And same with the claims adjusters, because they thought, we're all trained, we all have the same skill set, and the people that we allow to make those choices are skilled. They've been doing this job for a while. So Kahneman did a noise audit. Basically, the noise audit was, let's take a look at the actual results. And they did. And what did they find out? The dispersion of decisions was significantly more than 10%. It was more like 44%, right? And people with the same skills, same training, same background, had this wide divergence of choices, looking at the same data, but making different selections. So here's the problem with that. If in insurance, you don't necessarily know what the profit of a policy is until some time down the road, right? But if the divergence of your choices about policy, where the customer may be paying too much and then they leave you, or they're paying too little and they're not building enough capital for future losses, you're putting exposure in your books either way, right? That's the problem, right? And the same with the claims adjusters. That's noise. The company didn't believe or know that this risk existed. And so the next step is, well, what do? I mean, you can automate those choices and let your skilled people make decisions around the edges, right? Or you can just put a policy in place that says, here's a range. I mean, there are things that you can do to reduce the dispersion of choices that make. So the point is that wherever an organization has a wide range of subjective decision making, and you can evaluate those choices, you can measure the risk of human behavior in the organization, right? And there are a number of ways you can do that in contracts. You can do that in operational areas, performance in the organization. You can do that whether systemically we're being sued for the same reason. I mean, a number of different ways you can measure risk. These areas are being largely ignored because people don't understand what I call cognitive risk. So how do you start to address this problem? These are just a few suggestions. Operational risk, in many cases, is a risk by design. Therefore, we believe that operational risk can be improved by better design. And we think simplicity sounds easy, but simplicity is the end game, right? The reason that Apple is so successful is because a 5-year-old child can open up the box of a Mac phone or any kind of device and start using it right away. Right? It's so simple, it's intuitive. Human behavior, though, means that we make processes difficult for reasons we don't always understand. So therefore, we should be thinking about what are the impacts on people based on the workflows in the organization, on the governance models we have in the organization, the levels of communication. Are the people getting the information that they need in a timely manner? I mean, how we operate as an organization causing risks to human performance in the organization, throughout the organization? So we think operational risk is an area of opportunity, right? By going in and figuring out how to simplify what we're asking people to do so that where we can automate, we should automate. Where we need people to make judgments, to some extent that can be automated. But the big choices, the real important ones, should be done by humans. And in fact, the more we free up people from doing mundane work, the greater the opportunity for people to think about how to innovate in the company, how to be more effective, how to be more productive. So the issue of just keeping people busy for the sake of being busy is a risk, actually. We'll talk about why that is, but that contributes to the risk. So the insurance companies, are looking at algorithmic underwriting. I talked about that, so I'm going to skip that and go to the next step. So decision hygiene. So what we're talking about is developing a mindset, a concept of decision hygiene. How do we think about thinking, right? How do we break these big, tough problems down into little segments and begin to address these big problems by taking them apart, looking at each component, and then solving for the big problem over time. Break them up, evaluate them, and then do a global analysis, right? I mean, I wish I were smart enough to have come up with this. I'm stealing this from Kahneman. This is in his book, Noise, right? But it's very, very simple. These are simple things we don't do normally. Here's an opportunity that we're suggesting we have an opportunity to do it better. For managers, we suggest that instead of managers getting focused on the weeds, right, that we give people on the line the opportunity to be creative. And managers, instead of focusing on the detail, what managers are doing are focusing on the process. What are the assumptions that people in the organization make? How do they gather data? What facts are they using? And how did they come to their conclusion? The goal one is to enforce and create critical thinking across the organization. Why are we doing what we're doing? How are we doing it in the most efficient way? Is it the most productive approach to doing this, right? And making judgments based on the facts, right? And looking at how people came to those conclusions. And then as managers providing the resources, the capability, right? So looking at, if this were a portfolio of innovators in your organization, the front line would be the innovators. The managers would be nurturing that talent. And then the senior executives would therefore be focused on choosing and selecting and allocating resources on the most productive innovations, right? Governance then becomes a process of choosing, right, the most productive outcomes. All right, so ideally then focuses, you're looking at what are the influence factors that we need to put in place in order to achieve the behaviors that we're looking for. How do we influence the right behaviors? How do we influence through governance? How do we influence through workflows? How do we influence behavior through a technology? Right? How do we raise the level of the organization by influencing people, by challenging people to think differently about how the organization works and how the organization operates? So what I've done is I've created what I call the cognitive risk framework for ARM and cybersecurity. There are 5 pillars which are sort of beyond the scope of the time that we have today, but 5 pillars based on a multidisciplinary approach to thinking about the organization differently. And evidence-based, human-centered, right? Leveraging traditional risk practices as the foundation, but building on that, this understanding of human behavior from the executive level down, right? Because it's really a new way of thinking, which is what Zero Trust is really all about. It's rethinking what you've been doing and questioning how well it's working using real data, evidence, the impacts on human, and not just looking at one problem and say, oh, I've got enterprise risk fixed because I have audit looking at this one thing, or, you know, we have the human, the insider threat program, and we've gotten that right. No, these are systems, and in today's environment, there are no boundaries. So the behavior of other organizations, the behavior of our vendors, the behavior of our partners, our third-party providers, of even the best customers like Amazon and Microsoft, they pose a risk to the outcome of your organization. Some of that risk may be small, but have you measured that exposure? And then when you add those exposures up, do you understand what your true risk profile is as an organization? So what we're saying is that because this is new and it is different and it is hard for people to understand, the belief is that this is an area of exposure that we think is being missed and that it can't be quantified. So because of that, 2 years ago, I formed a nonprofit to conduct a study of this with 3 other universities. I was teaching at Columbia University, where I helped build their enterprise risk program from scratch 5 years ago, 6 years ago now. And was doing research and thought that this might be a good study. Well, the National Science Foundation, unfortunately, did not approve the study, but I am now trying to putting the same team together with a corporate sponsor to do live studies on what we've talked about. That is that is my goal, to have university researchers, real cybersecurity vendors who develop cybersecurity technology, load it up in a real company, and conduct research real time, live, right? And the goal is that we want to understand how to address the cyber paradox. We want to understand it better, but we want real data. We want to understand what it feels like in an organization when they're putting these things in place and understanding the impacts further. So I'll start right there. I could talk about this for all afternoon, but I'd like to take any questions or answer, provide any clarifications or whatever may be helpful.
Do we have any questions? Okay, if not, we'll move on. James, thank you very much. As always, I enjoy listening to this, and we appreciate you for taking part of our conference today, making this a success.
Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Have a good afternoon, everybody.